Ethan had learned to read the silences in Sophie's house like a second language. It was the hush after the television was turned off, the way dishes sat unwashed if anyone might overhear clinks. Sophie moved through rooms like someone who'd been taught to be small, flattening her presence until she was almost air. The first time Ethan saw the bruise, he thought it was clumsiness. The second time, when Sophie flinched at the sound of someone stepping on the porch, he stopped making excuses. She shrugged, laughed it off in a voice that tried on normalcy and found it didn't fit. "Old arguments," she said. "He's complicated." Sophie's stepfather, Gregory Hale, was a man who believed in order. He ran a small religious culture podcast and had opinions sharp enough to be knives. People in the neighborhood nodded when he said something. He had a smile that made apologies feel owed. He liked control wrapped in civility. That civility was the tightest prison of all. Ethan didn't plan to be a savior. He planned to be Sophie's friend. He brought coffee. He listened. One evening, as rain smudged the windows, Sophie let the story out in pieces. The isolation, the late nights locked in the study, the whispered threats that if she told anyone she'd ruin the family. The way Gregory said family like it was an altar. When she said quietly, "He's been saying things about honor and how women can be corrected," Ethan felt a cold clarity. It was one thing to hate a bully. It was another to recognize the tools that made him untouchable: reputation, the performative piety, the people who would believe his polished version. He didn't want to destroy Gregory with the blunt force of violence. He wanted the thing every predator fears most: exposure stripped of theater. He wanted the man who hid cruelty inside sermons to look foolish in the only arenas he valued. That night Ethan began to learn Gregory's world. His listeners, his donors, his favorite arguments, the activists who retweeted him without reading past his headlines. He made a plan the way you assemble a precise machine, with patience, pockets of light that, added together, might make the truth impossible to hide. "Are you ready?" Sophie whispered, as if asking to open a door. Ethan put his hand over hers and said, "We'll go slow, we'll go smart." Ethan learned quickly that the best evidence wasn't thunderbolt moments. It was the quiet geometry of small things. Gregory's power lived in habits: the neatly folded receipts, the selective texts deleted at midnight, the way he always left his laptop unlocked when he brewed coffee. You could trip a man up with something as ordinary as a spreadsheet. He started like any devoted amateur detective, awkward, earnest, and mildly terrified of messing it up. He took photos of Gregory's public live streams, transcribed clips where Gregory's tone slipped from preacher to predator. He asked Sophie to think like an archivist: dates, times, the smell of the room where things happened, what songs the house radio played afterward. Sophie, who had been trained to forget, surprised them both by remembering details with the accuracy of someone cataloging survival. Ethan's first win was silly and satisfying. Gregory had a habit of posting thoughts on social media late at night, moral aphorisms and veiled warnings that portrayed himself as a martyr fighting social rot. Ethan noticed a pattern. The aphorisms were the same lines he used in private when he told Sophie she needed to be corrected. The phrases matched too closely to be coincidence. He printed a few screenshots, then another, then an entire folder. He started an encrypted folder on his phone. Even the name was deliberate: Light. He'd learned that predators love grandiosity, so he stayed purposefully small. The plan was not to attack Gregory in public at first. It was to make Gregory trip over the truth in the quiet places that supported his public persona. Ethan also began to befriend Gregory's allies, but with the terrible restraint of a man pretending to be less sharp than he was. He went to the weekly community bake sale where Gregory volunteered. He learned the name of Gregory's assistant, Mara, the barista who brought him espresso, the local pastor who occasionally guest lectured on his podcast. People liked Gregory because he made them feel seen. Ethan kept that in mind when he listened. Small kindnesses opened doors. Mara mentioned offhand that Gregory kept a stack of old USB drives in the desk drawer, just in case. Ethan registered a possible lifeline. He also discovered Gregory's financial blind spot, a donor list that included one name he'd never heard, a foundation that had quietly funded Gregory's family values campaign. Donor transparency, Ethan realized, would be combustible. Sophie's role changed from victim to collaborator, and that shift was smaller than either of them would later describe. It began with her lending him a sweater that smelled like her, so he could sit on Gregory's porch and look less like a threat. It continued when she practiced talking not confessions but statements. "That night I was in the study," she'd rehearse. "He said he would ruin me." The sentences were small, defensible things. They were truths that could be matched to timestamps. One night, after hours of collecting mundane proof, a voicemail with an inappropriate tone, a deleted comment recovered from cache, Ethan and Sophie sat on Sophie's floor surrounded by printouts. They were exhausted, wired, ridiculous. They both laughed, because sometimes laughter is the only honest punctuation left. "We could just make him publish a cookbook and call it a day," Sophie joked, tapping a page with a faded sermon headline. "Only if it includes receipts," Ethan said, and they both grinned. The humor didn't make the plan less serious. It made them human amid the seriousness. They weren't reckless. Ethan wanted the kind of defeat that couldn't be explained away as spite. Documents, dates, voices that matched the persona Gregory curated. He wanted the court of public opinion to have an unambiguous dossier, because the most dangerous thing Gregory had was plausible deniability. As the folder named Light grew, so did their confidence. The machine they were building was patient and precise, the kind of machine that doesn't roar, it simply rewrites the record. Ethan had always liked puzzles. He liked the way small pieces, when placed correctly, made something larger and undeniable. Gregory's life, Ethan realized, was more puzzle than fortress, 1,000 small, loose ends waiting for someone patient enough to untie them. Mara was the thread. She was 30-ish, wore tired eyeliner and the kind of laugh that sounded like it had learned to be kind on purpose. Ethan bumped into her again at the community center, this time with a purposefully clumsy question about where Gregory stored old sermon notes. She answered like someone who'd been asked the same question a dozen times and finally felt no heat from it. "Desk drawer," she said. "He keeps..." Then, with the human impulse to confess something innocuous, "these old USBs. He calls them his backups." Ethan smiled and listened like a man cataloging treasure. He didn't push. Instead, he left, arranged later encounters that were astonishingly dull, a request for help moving boxes, a conversation about pets, and slowly Mara relaxed. She talked about Gregory with the peculiar tenderness one reserves for complicated people, fondness furring over irritation. She also slipped, once, a complaint about how exhausting it was to cover for him when his ego hit an episode. "You think he's fragile, but he's not," she said. "He's cowardly." Cowardice, Ethan thought, made better stories than bravado. The USBs, as it turned out, were not archives of perfect righteousness. One afternoon, when Gregory was delayed at a donors' meeting, Mara asked Ethan if he could help clear an inbox. "Just to save time," she said, and her hand brushed the desk in a way that lingered by a drawer. A moment later, with a grace practiced by people who have to make small deceptions for larger kindnesses, she pulled out a plain, black drive and handed it across the desk. Ethan didn't plug it in the office. He took the drive, wrapped it in a napkin like something illicit and sacred, and left. In his car, he breathed as if he had run a short race, exhilaration mixed with the sobering weight of what might be inside. The drive could be nothing. It could be dirt. Or it could be the kind of thing that, once light hit it, would not let Gregory find comfort in his polished parables. At home, Ethan didn't open the files alone. He called Sophie. She arrived in a hoodie, cheeks flushed from rushing, and they sat on the floor with a laptop between them like a tiny, intense campfire. They clicked through folders named with Gregory's predictable grandiosity: Family Values Final, Sermon Collection 2019, Donor Notes. Then beneath the expected files, a folder with a name so ordinary it would be expected to be empty: Personal. The file inside wasn't explicit. It never needed to be. It was a voice memo, poorly labeled. Note 617, a half-hour recording of Gregory practicing a speech. At first the words sounded like any other sermon, metaphors about protection, stories about fidelity. Then the tone shifted, a cadence that had been reserved for private correction leaked into public soliloquy. He used honor as a hinge. He rehearsed language about teaching discipline, about womanly failings that needed mending. He paused, and the pause was a confession of intent. The voice softened around a sentence that, if placed in court or in a podcast, would sound monstrous. Sophie's hand on Ethan's arm was small and fierce. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The recording did the work of accusation with a terrible precision. They found more. An expense file showing hush payments that were routed through an innocuous-sounding family outreach account. An email draft to a donor using a tone of alarm about protecting the family, which, in context, read less like charity and more like cover-up. A screenshot of a message to Sophie from months earlier, the timestamp matching the night she'd told Ethan she'd been locked in the study. Ethan did what he had promised. He cataloged. He copied, encrypted, and labeled. He annotated timestamps, cross-referenced emails with calendar entries, and made a small index that read like a bureaucratic poem, dates, statements, near matches to public language. He noticed the pattern that would become crucial later. Gregory's public narratives often mirrored the private language, but always shaved the teeth off the sentences so they could pass. They tested the files, too. Ethan asked a friend in digital forensics, a retired IT teacher with a soft spot for righteous puzzles, to verify metadata. The friend did not ask questions about motivations. He sent back confirmation, original timestamps, recent edits, file paths that corroborated the story. Verification was a balm. It made their anger feasible. But they didn't sprint toward exposure. They were careful because they had learned that accusation without foundation is cruelty masquerading as justice. Instead, they drafted an approach that would force Gregory's own networks to react. Donors presented with documented anomalies. A pastor who'd guest lectured offered a choice to stand with evidence or with silence. A podcast sponsor given a simple ethical ultimatum. That night, exhausted and wired, Ethan paced while Sophie made tea. They spoke in small, practical sentences, names to contact, possible allies, people who might be shocked into action. Their plan felt less like vengeance and more like a slow unmasking. They were taking the man who'd weaponized piety and asking his world to judge him by his own words. Sophie looked at the laptop and, with that small bravery that had become her hallmark, said, "Let's make sure the story is as clean as the lie he told." Ethan and Sophie weren't reckless. The most dangerous thing about Gregory wasn't his cruelty. It was the people who believed it was virtuous. They needed allies, people who could recognize the pattern without being dragged into scandal. The first seed was the pastor who had occasionally guest lectured on Gregory's podcast. Pastor Daniel was a kindly man with sharp eyes and a soft voice, the sort who preferred diplomacy over confrontation. Ethan approached him carefully, asking questions as if he were confused, curious. He didn't present evidence at first. He painted hypotheticals. Daniel listened, frowned, and in the end, asked one question that surprised Ethan. "Do you have proof?" Ethan did. He showed Daniel the recording, the emails, the timestamps. Daniel's face paled, not out of shock at the horror that was almost expected, but at how meticulously they had gathered it. This is undeniable," he said. "He's hiding behind faith, but this," he gestured to the laptop, "this is truth." Next came the donors. Ethan and Sophie drafted letters, neutral, professional, factual. They didn't editorialize, they didn't sensationalize. They just laid out inconsistencies, linked them to dates, provided evidence. They sent the emails one by one, careful to track responses. The reactions varied. Some paused, some pulled support immediately. A few tried to justify behavior they couldn't justify. Each response became a note in their growing symphony of accountability. Meanwhile, Gregory remained oblivious. He was consumed with the theater of his public life, live streams, podcasts, lectures, convinced that the world applauded him. He didn't see the quiet storm gathering in inboxes, in meeting rooms, in the hands of the allies he trusted most. Sophie began to feel a strange power she hadn't known she could possess. She could speak and people listened. She could point and systems reacted. But more than that, she felt safe, protected by preparation, by evidence, by careful planning. Ethan had taught her that courage wasn't a leap. It was a series of small steps, each one deliberate. One evening, Ethan brought a small whiteboard to Sophie's apartment. They sketched a timeline of Gregory's life for the past 2 years. Podcast episodes, guest lectures, emails, voicemails, donor interactions. Lines connected events, threads crossed and overlapped. The diagram looked chaotic at first, but soon it revealed the pattern. The web Gregory had woven around himself could now be traced, measured, understood. "This is where the dominoes will fall," Ethan said, tapping the center of the board. Sophie nodded. "And they'll fall themselves," she added. "We don't have to push." The thrill of strategy was intoxicating. The first time Sophie realized that they could bend Gregory's world without raising a hand, she laughed, a real, freeing laugh that hadn't come since she was a teenager. "He thinks he controls everything," she said. "He doesn't even know we're planting seeds in his garden." Ethan smiled. "And the garden will bloom in public." They paused then, letting the image sink in. Their work wasn't about humiliation. It was about truth, about seeing the man who had hidden behind words, faith, and fear, finally confronted with the consequences of those words. By the end of the week, emails had been sent, confirmations received, allies briefed. They had set the stage. Now all they could do was wait for the first stirrings of acknowledgement, for the first cracks to show, for the silence to break. Sophie looked at Ethan. "It's almost poetic, isn't it? Justice without rage, revenge without cruelty." Ethan nodded. "The best kind of revenge," he said, "the kind that sticks because it's deserved." It started small. Gregory, perched behind the camera for a live podcast, noticed a subtle shift. One of his longtime donors had stopped responding to cheerful check-in emails. A guest lecturer had canceled an appearance, citing schedule conflicts with unusual emphasis. Mara, ever loyal but quietly observant, had begun asking more questions than she answered. Gregory didn't recognize it as anything more than coincidence. The world, he thought, was chaotic, unpredictable, never suspecting that a precise machine of accountability had begun to hum around him. Meanwhile, Ethan and Sophie watched from the sidelines, careful not to gloat. Their phones pinged with confirmations, emails read, meetings postponed, subtle acknowledgments from allies that the information was spreading. It wasn't violent. It wasn't theatrical. It was undeniable. One evening, Sophie whispered, "He's starting to lose control." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He preferred to watch the pattern emerge naturally. But inside, a thrill coursed through him. The man who had thought himself untouchable, polished in persona, feared in private, was showing the first signs of strain. Gregory's language began to slip during his podcasts. The polished cadence faltered. Phrases he had rehearsed 1,000 times came out wrong, stilted, as if the words themselves were resisting him. Listeners noticed. Comments started asking subtle questions. Did he really mean that? Is this consistent with past statements? Ethan and Sophie cataloged these developments meticulously. Each misstep was proof that the web they had woven was working. They made no move to intervene. The dominoes were falling on their own, guided by the foundation of truth they had built. The emotional weight was heavy. Sophie, who had spent years shrinking herself, now sat taller. She spoke more freely to Ethan, to allies, to the rare people outside the immediate circle who needed to know. Every recounting of events was precise, factual, and measured. The very language Gregory had taught her to fear became her armor. Then came the first acknowledgement from someone Gregory trusted. Mara, who had been walking a delicate line between loyalty and conscience, delivered a quiet but firm warning. He knows something off. He's anxious. Be careful. Ethan smiled faintly. He's not careful anymore, he said. He's reacting, that's the difference. For the first time, Gregory was confronted with the world not bending to his will. The structure he had built, his reputation, his network, his narrative was faltering under the weight of documented truth. And the most satisfying part, he had no idea where the shift was coming from. Sophie leaned back in her chair, eyes bright with cautious triumph. It's like watching a slow sunrise, she said. You don't notice it at first, then suddenly everything is light. Ethan nodded, and the night has to end sometime. The next stage was subtle but strategic. Ethan realized that while Gregory was faltering, the real power lay in amplifying those small cracks. He began reaching out to former collaborators of Gregory's podcast, carefully phrasing conversations as concern for shared audiences rather than personal vendetta. Have you noticed inconsistencies in his messages lately? Ethan would ask casually, as if speaking about a topic of curiosity. His tone was neutral, almost bored, which made it more convincing. People began to notice patterns on their own. Small observations became threads that others pulled at, reviews of old episodes, timestamps and quotes that seemed benign in isolation, but painted a different picture when connected. Sophie, meanwhile, took a quieter but no less important role. She was the anchor for those who might waver under doubt. One of Gregory's closer associates reached out to her after receiving a discreet copy of a transcript. They were torn, hesitant to act against someone they had respected for years. Sophie spoke gently, clearly, using the evidence as a mirror rather than a weapon. This is the man we've documented. Look for yourself. Decide for yourself. It worked. The associate, confronted with facts, finally broke from loyalty to truth. I didn't want to believe it, they said, voice tight. But now I see. The ripple effect began. Podcasts began questioning Gregory indirectly. Sponsors reviewed donation histories, and social media commentators who once praised him subtly shifted their tone. Gregory, meanwhile, was in a private spiral, packing late at night, frantically checking emails and messages, wondering why the world seemed suddenly hostile. He tried damage control the only way he knew, performative statements about ethics, vague promises to clarify things publicly. But the truth was already stitched into the web Ethan and Sophie had built. Each attempt at public explanation only amplified inconsistencies. One evening, Sophie leaned over the laptop and whispered, "He's realizing the ground has moved under his feet." Ethan nodded, and he can't see who moved it. The most powerful moments, Ethan realized, were the ones Gregory could not control. The quiet, self-reinforcing movements of people who had once been under his influence but now acted independently, guided only by documented truth. That night, as Sophie and Ethan reviewed the latest responses, she let herself laugh softly. "It's like watching dominoes, one by one, falling perfectly," she said. "And we didn't have to touch a single one," Ethan replied, a rare smile tugging at his lips. It happened on a Tuesday, quiet and unassuming, the kind of day Gregory would have called ordinary. Ethan and Sophie had sent their final rounds of documentation to a carefully curated list. Sponsors, collaborators, and one journalist known for meticulous fact-checking. Nothing sensational, nothing exaggerated, only verified evidence, neatly compiled. By mid-afternoon, the first public acknowledgement appeared. A longtime sponsor posted a statement about withdrawing support due to inconsistencies in Gregory's messaging. The wording was precise, professional, a mirror of the careful language Ethan and Sophie had used. Gregory didn't react immediately. At first, he tried to dismiss it as a misunderstanding. Then another sponsor followed. Then a former collaborator wrote an article detailing discrepancies in podcasts and public statements, quoting the very recordings Ethan and Sophie had cataloged. Comments began to mount. each one dissecting the public image he had cultivated for years. Ethan watched it unfold, noting how each reaction was natural, almost inevitable because it was rooted in truth. Sophie sat beside him, pale but steady, eyes bright with vindication. Gregory, for the first time, was no longer performing. The smooth, rehearsed cadence he used to charm audiences failed him. Interviews became defensive. Live streams were awkward, fragmented. His once loyal following began asking questions he could not answer. Sophie's role now was visible but understated. She offered brief statements only when necessary, factual and unemotional. She did not gloat. She let the truth speak, and the truth was louder than any rhetoric Gregory could muster. The culmination came when a major platform hosting his podcast issued a statement. They would suspend episodes pending review after inconsistencies were documented. Gregory's network, carefully constructed over years, began to crumble like sandcastles in the tide. Ethan leaned back, exhausted but satisfied. "It's working," he said quietly. Sophie nodded. "It's like watching shadows lift, finally light." No one cheered, no one screamed. There were no dramatic confrontations. There was simply the quiet affirmation that power built on fear and deception could not survive the patient assembly of truth. Gregory's downfall wasn't a spectacle. It was a subtle, inexorable collapse, exactly as Ethan had envisioned. The next few days were surreal for Gregory. People he had once relied upon began calling, not with loyalty but with questions. Mara, careful yet resolute, finally confronted him directly. "I know what you've done," she said, her voice steady. "And the people around you are seeing it too. You can't spin this anymore." Gregory, who had always thrived on control, faltered. His rehearsed defenses, the polite threats, the veneer of righteousness, none of it held. Ethan and Sophie didn't need to appear. The truth itself was a mirror, reflecting every misdeed back at him in the eyes of those he trusted. Sophie, now stronger and more confident than ever, realized something crucial. Revenge wasn't in punishment. It was in reflection. The satisfaction came from seeing him confronted with his own patterns, his own words, and the inevitability of accountability. Ethan documented each interaction meticulously. Emails, voicemails, public statements, all recorded with precision. They weren't acting out of malice. They were creating an undeniable record. Every carefully placed document, every time-stamped file, was a shard of light against the shadow Gregory had cast for so long. One evening, they reviewed a chain of messages between Gregory and his remaining allies. The tone was defensive, nervous and fragmented. He tried to reclaim authority, but the responses were cautious, formal, and increasingly distant. The people who once feared him now demanded clarity, honesty, and accountability. Sophie looked at Ethan, her eyes reflecting both relief and a growing sense of empowerment. "It's over," she whispered. Ethan shook his head slightly. "Not yet. It's never over until the last domino falls, but we're close." The power of patience and precision was evident. Every action they had taken, every small step, had compounded into a force that no anger or eloquence could stop. Gregory was facing himself, stripped of pretense, unable to hide behind charisma or fear. For the first time, he realized that control built on manipulation was fragile, and the very tools he had used to dominate others were now the instruments of his undoing. The collapse of Gregory's network accelerated when some of his closest allies quietly shifted allegiance. People who had once accepted his polished persona began examining the evidence Ethan and Sophie had compiled. The subtle documents, recordings, and timestamps Ethan had painstakingly arranged became impossible to ignore. One of his guest lecturers, who had once admired Gregory's charisma, sent an email to the podcast platform. "These discrepancies are serious. Please review." Within hours, other collaborators followed. The web Gregory had woven to insulate himself from scrutiny began to unravel at the edges. Mara became an unexpected force. She spoke to those still loyal, calmly presenting the facts without accusation. "It's not about me or her," she said, nodding towards Sophie. "It's about the truth. You can't ignore it." Slowly, respect for honesty began to outweigh fear of Gregory's anger. Gregory, sensing the shift, tried to regain control. Live streams grew tense. He stumbled over words he had once delivered flawlessly. Sponsors asked direct questions. Collaborators required documentation. Each inquiry chipped away at his authority. Sophie, who had endured years of fear, now felt a strange exhilaration. She realized that the quiet courage she had cultivated, the small, deliberate steps with Ethan, was now reshaping the world around her. For the first time, she could speak without hesitation, act without second-guessing, and influence outcomes without intimidation. Ethan noticed the smallest of victories, an email from a longtime donor, carefully worded, withdrawing support, a social media post questioning a past episode, each domino falling in a sequence that was predictable yet satisfying. In the quiet of Sophie's apartment, they reviewed the latest developments. "He's losing grip on everything," Sophie said softly. Ethan nodded, "and the more he struggles, the faster the truth spreads. We set the machine in motion, now it runs on its own." The lesson was clear. Power maintained through fear and deception is fragile, and when truth is patient and precise, even the most polished facade crumbles. The momentum shifted entirely one Thursday afternoon. A well-respected journalist published an article detailing Gregory's inconsistencies, carefully citing the recordings, emails, and files Ethan and Sophie had compiled. The story was factual, calm, and devastatingly clear. No hyperbole, no dramatic flourish, just undeniable evidence paired with precise documentation. Social media lit up almost instantly. Followers who had once praised Gregory's charisma began questioning his integrity. Sponsors escalated their withdrawals. Even casual listeners started digging through archived episodes, noticing discrepancies they had previously overlooked. Gregory's response was frantic. He posted vague statements online, attempted live streams to clarify, and reached out privately to collaborators, trying to regain control. But his voice faltered, tone defensive, each word undermined by the avalanche of evidence already circulating. Mara confronted him again. "This is beyond your control," she said quietly. "The people who matter are choosing truth over fear. You can't fight it." Gregory's world, the meticulous network he had built over years, was unraveling in real time. Every ally he had relied upon now evaluated actions against evidence rather than loyalty. Every stage, every carefully crafted persona, was now a trap of his own making. Sophie and Ethan watched the tipping point from a distance. The satisfaction was muted, almost surreal. They didn't need to gloat. The truth, slow-moving and patient, had done the work that anger or confrontation never could. Sophie reflected on how far she had come. Once a girl hiding in silence, she was now the architect of accountability. Her voice, her courage, and her collaboration with Ethan had turned the tables on a man who had believed himself untouchable. Ethan, always the strategist, smiled faintly. "It's fascinating," he said. "The smallest threads of evidence, when woven carefully, can unravel the largest tapestry of deception." And the largest domino, Gregory himself, was now standing alone, exposed to the consequences of the life he had carefully curated. Gregory's control slipped faster than anyone expected. Sponsors formally withdrew support. Podcasts featuring his guest lectures quietly disappeared. Former collaborators released statements of concern, citing discrepancies and ethical questions. Mara, once hesitant, stepped back entirely, unwilling to be complicit in continuing the facade. Gregory tried to salvage appearances. Live streams became defensive, awkward, filled with half-formed explanations that sounded rehearsed but hollow. His audience, previously loyal and unquestioning, started leaving comments that cut like knives. This doesn't match your past statements. Can you clarify this inconsistency? Even casual listeners began documenting errors, sharing screenshots, and creating threads dissecting his words. Every interaction reminded Gregory that control built on fear is brittle. Every carefully crafted persona, every manipulated narrative, was now under scrutiny. The man who once commanded obedience and admiration found himself isolated, confronted with truth he could not bend. Ethan and Sophie observed quietly, continuing to document developments. They didn't interfere. They merely ensured that the story, the evidence, was organized, accurate, and undeniable. Each misstep by Gregory reinforced the narrative they had painstakingly built. Sophie's growth was evident. She no longer flinched at his name, no longer measured her words for fear of reprisal. She spoke to allies, clarified timelines, and presented evidence without emotion, a master of measured truth. Late one evening, Sophie looked at Ethan. "It's like watching a building collapse in slow motion," she said. Ethan nodded. "And we don't need to knock a single brick. The structure is collapsing on its own." The unraveling continued, relentless and precise, as the truth replaced the lies that had once held sway. By now, Gregory was a shadow of his former self. He wandered through meetings and live streams trying to reclaim authority, but every word, every gesture was met with quiet skepticism. Allies who had once offered blind support now asked questions, verified facts, and demanded transparency. Ethan and Sophie considered a direct confrontation but decided against it. There was no need. Gregory's own network and carefully cultivated image had become the instrument of his undoing. The power of patience, preparation, and precision had replaced any need for dramatic face-offs. One evening, Mara visited Sophie quietly. "He asked about you today," she said. "Not in anger, not in control, in confusion. He can't understand how this happened." Sophie smiled faintly. "He doesn't see the truth until he's stripped of pretense. That's the point." Ethan nodded. "We didn't need to fight him. We just needed to let the system do its work." The irony was delicious. Gregory had spent years manipulating appearances, controlling narratives, and commanding loyalty through fear. Now, the exact same network, guided by documented truth, stripped him of authority and dignity. His reputation, the fortress he had built, crumbled from within. Sophie, once small and silent, now moved through the world with quiet confidence. She had witnessed her own power in collaboration, strategy, and meticulous planning. Every fear that had held her captive had been transformed into insight and resolve. As the night deepened, Ethan and Sophie reviewed the latest public responses. Gregory's followers, collaborators, and sponsors were all recalibrating their perceptions. The man who had thought himself untouchable now faced consequences so precise and inexorable that no excuse could shield him. Sophie whispered, "He's facing himself now." Ethan smiled, "And it's exactly the justice we planned." The final days were almost anticlimactic. Gregory no longer tried to defend himself. Live streams stopped, emails went unanswered, and his public presence dwindled. The network that had once amplified his influence now quietly ignored him, focusing instead on truth and accountability. Ethan and Sophie continued to monitor developments, documenting everything meticulously. Each withdrawal of support, each public acknowledgement, each private admission was cataloged like a final proof that patience and precision had triumphed. Sophie had changed. She no longer flinched at raised voices or veiled threats. Her laughter, once rare and guarded, returned naturally. She walked taller, spoke clearly, and carried the quiet authority of someone who had reclaimed her life from the shadows. One afternoon, Mara stopped by, holding a small folder of correspondence. "I thought you should see this," she said, handing it to Sophie. It was a compilation of Gregory's attempts to regain control, polite requests, defensive explanations, and increasingly desperate pleas to allies. Each attempt was futile. Each was catalogued, time-stamped, undeniable. Sophie smiled softly, flipping through the pages. "He can't spin this," she said. "Not now, not ever." Ethan leaned against the doorframe. "No one could, not when truth has wings." They didn't celebrate loudly. There was no gloating, no triumphal announcement. The work had been quiet, careful, and methodical, and that was the satisfaction. The man who had controlled others through fear and manipulation had been undone by the quiet, patient accumulation of evidence. As evening fell, Sophie and Ethan sat together, reflecting on the journey. The storm had passed, the shadows had lifted, and in the calm they recognized the power of subtle, deliberate action over brute force. By now, Gregory was all but invisible. Sponsors had publicly withdrawn support, collaborators had made careful statements, and the media had documented inconsistencies across his podcasts and public appearances. The truth had spread, undeniable and precise, leaving him with no narrative left to control. Sophie and Ethan reviewed the final pieces. Every email, every recording, every time-stamped file had played its part. The system had done what confrontation could not. It had exposed him fully, objectively, and without embellishment. Sophie realized that this was the true power of their work. Justice had not been explosive. It had been meticulous, undeniable, and methodical. Gregory's downfall was a reflection of the life he had built on deception. He had thought himself untouchable, but the patience and precision of those he underestimated had undone him entirely. One evening, Sophie walked through her old home, now free from fear. Each room that had once held tension and silence now felt ordinary, mundane, and liberating. She had reclaimed her space, her life, and her voice. Ethan joined her, carrying the last folder of documents, neatly labeled and stored. "It's all here," he said. "Every thread, every pattern, every truth." Sophie smiled. "And it's enough." They didn't need applause. They didn't need recognition. The satisfaction lay in quiet completion, the dismantling of a man who had once ruled through fear, undone by nothing more than careful planning, documented truth, and patience. As they closed the folder together, Sophie whispered, "This is what freedom feels like." Ethan nodded, "And he built it for us with his own hands." The dust had settled. Gregory's presence in the community, in media, and in the lives of those he had controlled was almost entirely gone. No dramatic confrontation, no public spectacle, just the quiet weight of truth standing in place of lies. Sophie sat in the sunlight streaming through her apartment window, a cup of tea in hand, reflecting on the journey. She remembered the fear, the isolation, the nights of silence. Now every moment of dread had been transformed into a testament of resilience and strategy. She had learned to see, to document, and to act not impulsively, but with purpose. Ethan joined her, settling beside her without words. They shared a quiet look, a mutual acknowledgement of all they had endured and accomplished. The folder of evidence, once a weapon, now felt like a shield, a record of truth preserved. Mara had moved on, collaborators had realigned with accountability, and the world that Gregory had manipulated now operated with a new layer of clarity. The man who had once hidden cruelty behind charm was exposed in plain sight, his networks dismantled, his narrative unraveled. Sophie smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. "It's finally quiet," she said. Ethan nodded, "Not just quiet, free." The story they had written together, careful, deliberate, patient, had achieved justice without spectacle. There were no screams, no revenge fantasies, no theatrics. Only truth, methodically gathered, patiently deployed, and unstoppable. Sophie leaned back, letting the golden light of the late afternoon warm her face. For the first time in years, she felt safe, empowered, and unafraid. And for Ethan, witnessing her reclaim life and voice was the ultimate reward. In the end, the most satisfying victories are those that unfold quietly, leaving only clarity, freedom, and the comforting knowledge that justice, patient, precise, inevitable, has been served. The end.